So hello everyone and welcome to Santa Rosa Zine Fest 2020. Sonoma County Library is thrilled to have partnered with the volunteer collective SRZF to bring you this virtual Zine Fest. And before we introduce our amazing presenters, I just want to go over a couple of details of how this session will work. So to begin with, if you have questions for Maia and Tessa, if you could please use the Q&A feature rather than the chat. So feel free to use the chat to make it interactive and comment on the artist's work and chat back and forth. But if you have a question that you're hoping to have addressed, please use the Q&A and we'll try to get to it. Also, we do have Spanish interpretation available, which can be accessed by clicking interpretation at the bottom of your screen in the lower right-hand corner and selecting Spanish. And then all sessions will be recorded in English and Spanish and posted on the Sonoma County Library YouTube channel. For more information about other Sonoma County Library virtual events and library services, please do visit our website at sonomalibrary.org. And now I am very happy to turn things over to Chelsea from SRZF to introduce our amazing presenters.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Tessa. Not Tessa, Tara, sorry. It's super exciting to be here to hear from Tessa and Maia. I'm going to read bios for both of them now. Maia Kobabe is a non-binary queer author and illustrator from the Bay Area. Her first full-length book, Genderqueer, a memoir, was published in May 2019 and recently translated to Spanish. Maia's short comics have been published by the Nib and in many anthologies, including The Secret Love of Geeks, Faster Than Light Y'all, Gothic Tales of Haunted Love, Advanced Death Saves, and Be Gay, Do Comics. Before setting out to work freelance full-time, he worked for over 10 years in libraries. And I'm sitting here at Positive Images with a copy of Genderqueer, and Positive Images is Sonoma County's LGBTQIA center, and Maia made this comic for us in 2017 about our center. Notably, Maia has also been publishing since about mid-year this year, recent political zines, sort of instructional zines teaching people how to tune into city council meetings, letting people know what large organizations have endorsed ballot measures. And that was kind of what led us to dream up this conversation with Tessa Hulls. Tessa is an artist, writer, adventurer who is fascinated by the concept of home. She's currently focusing on her nonfiction graphic novel, Feeding Ghosts, forthcoming in 2022 from MCD at Farr, Straus, and Giroux. In summer of 2020, when Seattle's Capitol Hill became CHOP, Capitol Hill organized protest, Tessa began doing news coverage through comics posted to her Instagram, and those received a lot of attention. Tessa is a compulsive genre hopper who's worked in various capacities as an illustrator, lecturer, cartoonist, editor, interviewer, historian, writer, performer, chef, muralist, conductor of social experiments, painter, bicycle mechanic, teacher, and researcher for organizations including the Washington Post, Henry Art Gallery, the Rumpus, On the Boards, Seattle Art Museum, Atlas Obscura, the Project Room, Washington Ensemble Theater, Washington Trails Association, Microsoft Research, and others. I just realized that I read a longer bio than the one you gave me, one part of your website bio, but I'm stoked to have given a really thorough introduction to you both, and I will turn things over to you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks, Chelsea.
Thank you to together. Maia, it's so nice to actually talk to you.
Yes. For people attending, Tessa and I have emailed, but we've never actually talked either in person or virtually before. We're both really excited about this. I think we've been Instagram mutuals for a while, and I was really inspired by and into the short political comics you started posting. Well, I started following you in June, so that's when I started seeing them. And I immediately had this feeling of kinship where I was like, oh, this is another person who's working on a long-term graphic novel project, but is setting that aside in this really urgent feeling political moment to do these short pieces for Instagram. I assume you make no money on. I don't make any money on my comics. But there's some moments where it just feels really, really important to like info share about something. And I wanted to talk to you partly about um, when you make choices to do an info comic versus maybe a topic that seems important, but you're like, no, I really have to work on my graphic novel right now. And I wanted to start there and then go out into other topics.
Yes, that is a perfect segue. And part of the reason, we've said we're so excited about this conversation is I don't think either of us has a great answer to that.
No.
And the way that I ended up in the position of doing this CHOP coverage is I was texting with my editor, and when the protest in response to George Floyd killing came up, I just ethically didn't feel like I could put my head down and keep working on an unrelated story. So I basically texted her and was like, I can't sit this one out. I morally have to go in. And she really gave me her blessing, which I appreciate a lot. But basically, I'd lived in Seattle for a really long time, 5 blocks from where CHOP sprang up. And that neighborhood is where I have my deepest community ties. Those are the bars that I've stayed in till closing. And like I've been on stages with microphones at most of the places that were within that zone. So yeah, I saw that there was just no way to get clear information and meant to stay for 3 or 4 days, just doing on the ground interviews. And then when it became clear there was such a need for news, I ended up staying for over 3 weeks and just
Oh my gosh.
sitting on the floor of an arts nonprofit. They were all working from home, so they just gave me a key to their offices. And so I was a block outside the barriers. So for me, that question was really one of moral obligation. And I've been thinking a lot about that Toni Morrison quote where I'm going to butcher it, but essentially, if you have power, your job is to use that power. And if you're free, your job is to set someone else free. And I think particularly given the nature of the graphic novel that I'm working on, which is a lot about immigration narratives and intergenerational trauma, it just felt like I couldn't in good faith work on that without trying to help in this really pressing moment. So I want to turn that question back on you and ask what you start feeling like you needed to turn your voice towards this.
Gosh, I'm actually going to roll back a little bit back to 2018. So the book that I have already published, that came out in 2019, I worked on it for the entirety of 2018, which was the midterm election year. And it was just so intense working on this graphic novel. I had a very tight deadline. They wanted 250 pages in like 8 months, basically.
That's not even possible.
The only reason it was possible is because I was writing a memoir, so it was my own life, so I didn't have to come up with any of the story, right? I didn't have to write a plot. I just had to, and I had a lot of notes and a lot of journal comics and diaries and stuff to pull from. Anyway, the point being, I was working 7 days a week on it. I worked from noon until midnight. I was trying to ink 5 pages a day. It was a very intense schedule of work. And as the summer of 2018 was happening and it was like leading up to the midterms, and I was like, I'd be at my drawing desk being like, am I making the right choice? Like, I decided to work that whole year, but I was like, should I be registering voters? Should I be like planting trees? Should I be volunteering in a food bank? Like, is there something else I should be doing right now? Because I don't know if this is this what the world needs from me? But at that time, I kind of had to, at that time, the choice that I made in 2018 was that I was going to keep working on my graphic novel and I was going to keep pushing on that. And it was just my fervent hope that I was like, I'm writing a story that's about, gender identity and non-binary and trans issues and communicating with your family. And my hope is that this is also the work, and that this work will also serve the world, and that making this will be worth it, will be worth sitting out the sort of like volunteer opportunities that I'm not taking. And I feel good about that choice right now because the book has had a really good reception, and many people have told me that it has improved their lives, help them connect with their family members. So I feel good about that. But now in 2020, I'm working on another graphic novel, and that I have set down partly because it's a fictional story, and it's harder to justify for me working on a story that's fictional when I'm like, I feel like I have to make comics about like the ballot. I have to make comics about ballot deadlines. I want to make comics about like connecting your city council, and that just feels really important right now. So I feel like I've made both choices. Do you have a moment where you feel like you have chosen your graphic novel over an urgent political moment? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm doing that now. And that was one of the interesting things that happened with going viral around CHOP coverage and suddenly having this large swath of the internet think that I was a full-time comics activist covering breaking news. Where
Yeah.
I'm, whoa, 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 hold up. Historian. I like archives. I like things where I can read 6 books, mull it over. So I think that was hard for me to kind of disengage from the really urgent need, because I was getting DMs from all of these people being like, will you please make a piece about my brother who was killed by the police? And, all of these things where they're all so valid, but I think it's really, really important for longevity to find your lane and stick to it. And that's not something, I think that's vital both internally and externally. And so after CHOP ceased to exist as a place, I really had to do some ethical searching as to what my boundaries were. And so that's why I've decided that what I'm doing now is each month on the first of the month, I'll put out a comic that has to do with some topic in racial equity. And I'll sink a bunch of time into doing interviews and doing the research, but I'm basically not responding to asks. Well, I'm saying no, I'm not ignoring them, but I'm basically saying like, this is the balance I'm striking, because my book deadline, I'm actually about to, for the first time in my life, not make a page deadline. So
It's, you know what? That's 2020 for you. Like,
yeah.
This year has not gone the way any of us thought it was going to go. And I think that, I mean, I hope, it sounds like you have a good editor. I think she's probably going to be understanding. This is a year of missed deadlines of every kind. I think people have missed deadlines, people have missed work deadlines, people have not met personal goals. That's just the year we're living in, right?
I've been calling it the year of very valid extenuating circumstances.
Yes, I love that.
Actually,
I'm gonna use that after this meeting. I really like your impulse to say I'm gonna do this much work per month. I think that's really smart, and I really resonate with that. And something that I was thinking about in sort of like July, August, as like Black Lives Matter stopped being the only thing I was seeing on Instagram, and I was like, how do I maintain a certain level of activism that is sustainable and continued? And two things that I thought of: one, I made a bunch of like donations to all the causes that were popping up, but I also I set like $5 monthly donations to like 5 different places, and I was like, I'm just gonna commit to like supporting these places in the long run. Like, this is not going to be a 1-month thing. I want this to be something that like these organizations that I care about can include my $5 in their ongoing budget. So I was like, okay, making sure my donations are a continuing thing. And then the other thing, I had this idea of doing every month, doing a series of commissions that people could, anyone online who follow, commission me for something, and then I would donate all of the money to a cause that had popped up that month specifically and seemed to need like some urgent right now attention. And I haven't actually put that into practice yet, because I then got a top surgery date. So I am actually 4 weeks post top surgery right now, and just drew for the first time in a month. So I didn't get that started before surgery happened, but that is like a goal of mine for as soon as I'm sort of like backed up to drawing speed. So I think that, maybe there's something in that of saying like, okay, this much I can do, this many hours I can donate, or this much I can give, but I really also have to like focus on my, your what's in your lane, your main goal. I know that your story Feeding Ghosts is about family history and, like you said, immigration. Is that a project that when you work on it, does it feel like something, do you have a hope for it that is also kind of like a gift to the world, or like also pushing forward not that it's a political book, but like that it has sort of a progressive agenda? Do you feel that way?
Yes, definitely is the short answer. And this ties in with one of the questions that we sort of toyed around in our email thread about how in different ways our work is informed by trying to navigate the expectation of a binary when we don't really fit in either category. So for you, it's gender, and for me, it's race. And being in this sort of like in between, little bit, both and. Kind of what you were saying with your book, really how it resonated with people, and it was a story that needed to be told. When I've done in progress readings, because grants have required public programs, so when I have shared what I'm working on, the response that I get from other people who are mixed race to trying to navigate that territory, I think yeah, trying to add something to that canon that goes into that territory with a little bit of nuance and ties it into history and sort of across generations. Um, I have to not really think about what I'm trying to achieve, or I will never
Yeah.
get it
Yeah.
done. But
Yes.
in the back of my mind, I'm like, yes, this is not divorced from my activism. I think
Yes.
in some ways, looking more into the history that led to my family's trauma is what really made me fuse my artist and activist identities. So I don't really feel like I can separate them in any way. And something that I'd love to hear you answer, because so I read your book, I have many post-it notes. Um,
Oh.
and one of the things I really love about your work is that you're so clearly a methodical researcher.
Mm.
And I want to hear more about how research ties into your process and what you make.
Oh gosh. Well, I will say that I don't know. I don't even know that I would claim the title of methodical researcher for myself, but what I will say is that I worked in libraries for 14 years before I went freelance full time as a cartoonist. I love reading. I love spending time in libraries. I started volunteering as like a high schooler, and then on the back of my 4 years of volunteer hours, got a job in my college undergrad library as a work study federal grant, and then because I was so excellent, they asked me to come back as a manager after I graduated, which was the only job offer I got as a newly art major graduate. So I then continued to work there for 6 more years. So I think really what happened is I got very good at using the library catalog, and I got good at, poking through books and following down like, oh, this author mentioned this author quoted this author. I love looking any nonfiction book. I bibliography in the back, and I see, okay, what is all of these author sources, what informed their thought. And I do really like following those sort of threads back. I find it very interesting if I get like an intellectual hero to then know who their intellectual heroes are. So that's, I would say, is if I have a research bent, it's more of that. It's almost more of like a desire for an intellectual treasure hunt, perhaps. I do like following those little threads. um, and so for genderqueer, I mean, it's a personal story, it's based on my life, but I do try to read very widely. And like, for example, I read like one of Judith Butler's books while I was working on it. No Judith Butler quotes made it into genderqueer, nor did I ever reference it in the text, but it was something I was reading while I was working on the book, partly to just see if there was anything in there that needed to go in the book almost, and then I not using it. But I did do more research than even made it in there, and I'm sure that you are doing more research than will make it onto the page of your book as well, because I know you have both gone back to where your grandparents lived, right? So you've done in-person sort of scouting, you've done family interviews, right? And then you had a book translated, a book that your grandmother wrote, is that right?
Yeah, so a huge part of the footwork for my project has involved addressing my woeful ignorance about Chinese history. So at this point, I've probably read close to 100 books. And
Wow.
well, I mean, I had to, and it's
Yeah.
again the idea of bibliography hopping, which is
Mm-hmm.
totally what I do. And in some ways, I think the way that I come out a story is I need to understand the broader web of the landscape before I can really feel like I have a handle on any of the sort of discrete points within it. So whenever I'm doing anything, my first step is just to read and read and read. And I think it's really important to also read from the other side and to find
Mm.
contradictory viewpoints and see the ways in which language is guiding how a story is being interpreted. And that's actually something that I found really interesting, is how the internet even it becomes such an echo chamber even in the quotes that are being used, where you start to see the things that are going viral and being picked
Yes.
up, and you see a quote and you're like, oh, interesting, what book did that actually
Yeah.
come from? What if I go read that book and
Yeah.
see that this is actually housed within an essay that's making a really different point? And
Yes. Yeah.
yes, you must read, you must always read.
This is one of the reasons that I refuse to use Twitter, is because of how everything is reduced to either essentially a single headline, a single quote, and the context is stripped away from it. And I find that so um just not the way that I enjoy engaging with the world. I actually have a personal policy of, and this is another thing I really try to have to balance with, like trying to make work that is addressing current issues. I don't like hot takes. I don't want to make hot takes. I'm uninterested in making a hot take. In fact, one of the ways I decide if it feels important enough to make a comic about a political topic is if I think of it and I put it on my to-do list and it still seems important tomorrow and it still seems important the day after it, I do it like 3 days later. I often wait at least like an idea will come to me and I'll wait like 3 days, because it's, if the like impulse has faded within 3 days, then I'm like, maybe that was a passing thing and I didn't need to comment on it. But if like by the weekend it's still really nagging at me, then I'm like, okay, I guess I'm going to sit down and start reading some articles about this and making sure I know what I'm saying. And I loved your point about reading from the other side. I hadn't thought about that I was doing that consciously, but it occurred to me when you said that for some of my short info comics, sometimes I do try to anticipate how a person might argue against my point and then address that in the initial work itself, so that people don't argue with me, because I'm also uninterested in arguing with strangers online. So I'm like, okay, what is like the main way that someone could disagree with me, and how do I like a point before they even get a chance to make it?
Yeah, and I think that's also just a part of creative due diligence, is that if you are telling a full story, it has to contain those answers kind of in even like the negative space of how it's crafted. And I think that's one thing I appreciate about your work. I'm particularly thinking about the piece you did about square dancing and how it's broken into, you know, traditional male and female roles. And you have such a talent for educating your viewer or reader through your experiences in a way that's so organic, and you're just bringing them along for the journey. And actually, if you want to speak to how that comic resolves, I think it's a great microcosm of sort of how you work as an activist and educator.
Yeah, so the comic Tessa's mentioning ran on the Nib a couple of years ago. You can find it on my website and on the Nib. But basically, I took this traditional Eastern European folk dancing class with my mom at a senior center for about a year. And part of what I liked about it is that most Balkan dances are gender neutral. Everyone stands in a circle and you all do the same steps, and it's very repetitive. It's very communal, and it just felt really comfy there. Even though I did also, in my very first class, which was pretty shortly after I started using my pronouns, EMR specific pronouns, I introduced myself with them. By the way, I was the youngest person in this class by probably 30 years. I would say the next youngest person was like 55 or 65 even. And everyone was kind of like, I don't know what that person was talking about. Moving on. And then we learned a bunch of dances. And then after having done this for like 7 or 8 months, our teacher finally brought to the class a dance that was gender divided, and where the men and the women were supposed to do different steps. And I was like, oh God, yuck, what do I do? Ugh. And it was just this moment where I was like, I can either say nothing and I can just go along with the female part, which is what everyone in this class is expecting, or I can speak up and I can be like, hey, this isn't my favorite choice, but I'm actually going to join the men's part, which was smaller. There were less men in the class. And I was like, what's to lose? I'm in a room full of retired senior citizens. I'm just going to join the men's part. And I did that. And everyone was really welcoming about it. The men were like, you did great. And then the next time, two women were like, I also am going to dance the men's part today. Why not? And it really kind of like just loosened, that divide. And I think me stepping over I don't know that the people in the class saw it as like a non-binary person trying to break down gender norms. Even just by the act of doing something that maybe was not perceived the way that I meant it, it sort of made other people go, yeah, why does it matter which part we dance? It's just literally we're senior citizens dancing in front of no one. Like, who cares? And so that's sort of like what I wrote about. And I don't know, it's that actually piece almost became the last genderqueer. And then it didn't quite make the cut of the book. So it ran on the Nib instead. And I think,
oh, one quick question, Maya. Chelsea's messaging me. She is asking if she can screen share that comic for a sec.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think you can find it on I believe it's on my website.
Oh, yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, it's hard. I was trying to express this process to someone recently, and step one of it is I have one thought that I can't seem to let go of. And like, that's what I'm saying about like the waiting 3 days or 5 days or however long. It's like, and it's often like one sentence, and it's usually one sentence that makes it somewhere into the script of the comic. And it's just one sentence that I'm like, this just keeps I keep thinking this, and I can't, the way to get it out for me is comics, because that's the medium that I use. If I was a songwriter, I would write a song. If I was a poet, I'd write a poem. What do you feel like is the seed that starts a comic for you? Is there a
Uh,
moment?
there is a quote. There's an amazing female science fiction writer named Connie Willis, and she said,
Doomsday Book.
"Oh yes, yes." She said once in an interview, "Writers hate it where you ask where they get their ideas. That is like asking Humphrey Bogart in The African Queen, where did you get your leeches?" And that is completely how I feel. Like there's no element of choice in what I do. It's just kind of like, all right, I will not be free of this until I make whatever this is that is wanting to come out. And I totally agree with what you're saying about hot takes. And I think if you are responding instantly, you are doing everyone involved a disservice.
Including
Because,
yourself,
yeah,
because you're
exactly.
probably wasting your time to some extent.
And your emotional investment.
And you're getting pushed around by the news instead of pushing back against it.
And I think that is when there's a topic or there's something happening where I start to see, basically when I start to see the camps diverge into these completely, like the Venn diagram, it's just the center is gone, and I see how things are going off the rails, that's when I feel like, okay, let me try and make something that goes back to that center of that circle and can try and say, like, there is a middle ground here, not as an apologist, but like, let's look at the ways in which there are still intersections, and we can all still be human. So I think that's kind of how I see my role. And like, that's when I feel the need to try and use my voice to be like, remember humanity, accountability, humanity are not mutually exclusive.
And you literally did this thing where you made two different spaces, which is exactly what I did when I was talking about two genders. And we're like, how do we blur these circles? How do we like mesh these seemingly opposing, but actually both human groups back into each other? How do we do that? Yeah, I don't know, but I'm really glad that we're both working on it, because it's a problem that needs multiple hands.
Yeah, and actually, this is one of the things that I'd love to know is what helps you feel faith in that can be effective, or like, how do you basically not feel like you're screaming helplessly into a void?
um that's a great question, and I feel like one answer is that I have a lot of people write me really nice things. I actually get a ton of positive feedback online, which I feel very lucky about. And sometimes I wonder about the fact that I've really never been significantly harassed online. And I'm like, is this white privilege? Is this a cis passing privilege? Is this the fact that I've like always posted really queer content, so my entire readership is like very queer people, so that I'm only speaking to people who are in my echo chamber bubble? I don't know. But I would say pretty much every time I post a comic, and especially a comic that is tangling with gender, I have at least 1 to 10 people say, this helped me in my actual life. Like, my life is like, I had a conversation because of this, or my father is using my pronouns now because of this, or I was better able to explain this to my child because of this, or something like that. And it's extremely powerful, and every time it's that little like, okay, this is why I did this. It's for that reader, that maybe it is only one person, but like, if I can spend a couple of days drawing something that makes one person's life better, like, that's worth it. I don't It's hard to imagine like fixing anything on like a bigger scale, but also the scale is just humans, right? It's just humans with feelings. And I do think a lot about how I think so much damage of our political system is made by people who are full of a lot of shame and greed and rage and a feeling of being unseen. And if I can try to help people feel less shame, feel more seen, feel more connected, I hope that is, gonna it's gonna bleed out into the water, like dropping one drop of ink into a bucket or something. Yeah. Did you feel like you received encouragement from your Instagram comics, or was it more just exhausting?
I think a little bit of both. I mean, I felt very, very, very grateful to be able to do something that felt like it was of concrete use at a time when that was necessary.
Yeah.
I've been wrestling with this sense of helplessness of, you know, how do you contribute to being on the right side of history? And how do you, I think the question of how you use your privilege, it's an interesting one if you really follow that through the nuanced layers of where it leads. And so I was really glad to be able to answer it through that and have the feedback that it was helping. But at the same time, it's really interesting having the bulk of the people who now follow me on social media have come to me through this. That's not actually what I do. And one of the things that kind of my long-term like brand, if I have to have one, because a brand is basically a series of actions that other people then ascribe a pattern to, is I go spend many, many months off grid, completely away from the internet. And that is something that I have fiercely fought for and protected. So I'm like very much a slow cycle analog person who's really overwhelmed by, I think some people are good at interneting and I'm just like, no, it burns, it burns. So it was like both really positive and also like, this fire hose is.
Yeah, how do I tame this? How do I, you're like wrestling with it. You're like, less water. I needed just a little. Yeah, I know. I saw your post just a couple of days ago. You're like returning from 3 weeks offline. And I was like, whoa, because I don't know, because, you know, I follow enough people that I don't necessarily notice if one person doesn't post for 3 weeks. But it was interesting to see sort of like, you're like, I have returned from the woods post. And I was like, I'm so glad Tessa got to go to the woods. Like, I have not been to the woods in a long time. And I miss the woods. Yeah. Okay, I just was looking down. I have taken a couple of notes while you were talking. You one of the things Chelsea read in your intro was that your work, you say one of the themes of your work is the idea of home, the concept of home. Can you expound on that a little?
Yeah, so I actually am relatively local for this event. I grew up in Point Reyes, and
Nice.
my mom still lives there. Actually, quick tangent because I love libraries too. I was back there about a year ago, and I went to the Point Reyes Library to see if they would give me a library card because I was there for a while. And I was making small talk with a librarian and mentioned that I still had my childhood library card number memorized, 211110056945542. And he was like, oh, well, I can just give that back to you. So I have my functional childhood library card back. Anyways, tangent, but that was like the best thing that happened to me in 2020. Now, okay, how do we get here? Yes, home. So I kind of had this interesting background where both my parents are first generation immigrants, and my mom was born in Shanghai and my dad was born in London, and they somehow ended up in a town of 350 people. So this is before, like, we didn't have TV, the internet didn't exist yet. And so I was kind of just this feral child who had a library card and access to a lot of wilderness and no real notion of what American culture was or how I fit in it. And so I think I didn't really realize that I had grown up in a really idiosyncratic household that wasn't very American until I left. And that's actually something that I'd be so curious to talk to you about, because reading Genderqueer, I saw that you also grew up in like a pretty isolated world.
I was like, that's so interesting because everything you're saying. My parents are not immigrants. They're both born here in California, although my dad is I guess my dad's mother is an immigrant to the US, but so anyway, I have a little bit of that in my family, but like I just felt American growing up. But anyway, but I also grew up very rurally. I grew up in the Bay Area. I lived variously either an hour out of the nearest town or half an hour of the nearest town. The places that had like when we got internet, it was dial up and it was terrible, and like cell phones didn't work at my house, and like, you know, it was like it took 45 minutes to get to like the nearest place to buy milk, like, you know what I mean. And I also grew up without TV, so I also feel like I really was very not in touch with current culture as a young person, but I also had a library card, and I just read tons and tons of books. And yeah, I feel like I very much grew up outside and in libraries. And I value that so much. And looking back, I'm so like, at the time I was so annoyed that my parents like didn't have a TV and like I couldn't watch movies and stuff. But now as an adult, I'm like, oh my God, like I did so many things that were more valuable while I was not watching television as a child. I'm so glad that I picked up snakes and got muddy and learned how to ride a bike and read 200 fantasy novels per year instead. Um,
Yeah,
and
that's
I
pretty much what I did too.
yeah, cheers. It was great. I would go back. No, I wouldn't. I don't want to go back in time. But I also like I lived in a two different houses in my childhood. Both of them were houses that we rented, and both of them were places that I just deeply fell in love with. I mean, when you live on like a beautiful piece of land that has like blackberries and like ponds and like forests and stuff, how do you not fall in love with where you live? And it gave me just an unbelievable just appreciation of and almost adoration or wonder at the land of California, specifically the Bay Area. And when I had to move from the house that I lived in for 20 years because our landlords decided to sell, and we could not afford, and we had to move to the suburbs, I felt like a plant that had been ripped out of the soil. I mean, it was rough. It was very hard for me. And so I feel like I also have chased this like feeling of like home and homesickness. And then now as an adult and like watching huge swaths of California burn every year, it's awful. And it's just, and then learning more about like the indigenous people who lived in this land before all the white people came. And it's just very interesting. And I have a feeling that someday I will probably make a book that is about California and a California history and being a white person living in California. And um so the one sort of like piece of immigration history that's in my family is that my grandmother is descendant from people who fled Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution and actually moved to Mexico, which had a really welcoming immigration policy at that time. And she grew up in a completely Russian Orthodox community, but in Mexico, and then moved to the US later after that. And then a place that I grew up going to as a child was Fort Ross, which was a Russian settlement fort here on the California coast. I don't know. So there's all these pieces that I'm like, but I feel like I haven't, again, I'm not ready to write that story yet. Like that's not a think about it for 3 days story. That's like a think about it for like a decade story. You know what I mean? Like that's a story I haven't lived enough yet to know what that key line is. That's like the through line of that story. I just know that it's really important to me. We'll get there eventually.
Yeah.
Is that, I feel like maybe Feeding Ghosts is kind of like that for you. Is it?
Oh yeah. I mean, I didn't start it. I tried very hard to never tell this story and to
Oh.
spend my life around running away from it and not facing it.
Oh.
Because I'm on year 5 of this process, and so my day job right now is to go live in the darkest trenches of intergenerational trauma all day, every day. And I think there kind of came a point in my life in which I realized the adventure side of what I did was feeling a lot less like freedom and a lot more like running away. And yeah, it's that's definitely something that I'm wrestling with the question of self-care is how do you take care of
I was
yourself?
just gonna ask that. I was like, do you have a therapist?
um yeah, it's well, so actually what I'm doing, and this is kind of silly, but I feel like trauma wins when you lose the capacity to laugh at yourself and to find humor.
Oh.
And so I have, hold on, I have a visual, stand by.
Ooh. This is going so well.
So I have these dinosaur paintbrush holders. This
Yeah.
one, Norbert, and then my partner, who's a sculptor, made me a triceratops. But so they, I'm making appearances of them in Feeding Ghosts, and I've made a rule for myself that the number of times I draw my paintbrush dinosaurs has to be equal to or greater than the number of times I draw my crying mother.
Ah.
Really like have a post-it note of being like, well, just do 2 more crying mothers. I guess I have to
I
put
have to do 2 more dinosaur. Oh my God, I love that so much.
well, it's because I have to stay sane.
Yes.
You know, because it is
Oh.
such a dark, painful story. And it's not something I would choose to just dwell in for half a decade by choice.
Oh man. Oh God, I love that. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I'm trying to think of what my version of that is, and I'm pretty sure my version of the dinosaur paintbrush holders is fan fiction. And it's like every time, yeah, that I like talk about some like really kind of like ugly, raw, moment of gender dysphoria, like I have to have a scene after that where I just like talk about reading fan fiction or something like that. It's like, yeah, you have to oh God, 2020 has been a year for me of very intentionally indulging in a certain amount of escapism, not all the time and not to the extent that it excludes being aware of what's going on, but being like, no, I think it is important actually that I watch 12 hours of a K-pop reality TV show because I need it. And it's like including whatever that draws you in that's like, yeah, sort of like whimsy, light, feels sort of quote unquote frivolous, unimportant, but is actually what kind of like, yeah, keeps you buoyed up through the stretches of everything else. Um, mm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Are you have you been showing your family drafts as you work on the book?
Oh, that's a complicated question. So I'm working with my mother on this book, and these days when people ask what my book is about, my short answer is just complicated mothers.
Mhm.
Um, and it's basically at its heart about how mothers and daughters both damage and save one another. So to have my mom as a collaborator in this is it's two steps forwards, one step back. And I think looking at our relationship through the lens of this cultural divide between Chinese values and American values has really fundamentally changed our relationship in really positive ways. But it's very hard for her that I'm telling this story. And I think we've come to realize that our notions of healing, we have very different ideas of what that word means. And so it's kind of a constant negotiation of of what feels safe to us. And I will
Yeah.
say that the one thing that I'm doing with every pass through I do of the book and every page I draw, the guiding message that I'm or the guiding thing that I'm trying to make sure I'm doing is I ask myself, where can I put in more compassion?
Yeah.
And I think in general, that is something that I try and put in all my work. And that's something that it just feels like our world right now has so little room for grace. And we have so little generosity towards each other. And I I really wish that there was a way that we could bring back some of that sense of compassion not having to be a zero-sum game, and we could extend that to one another more. So it's
Yes.
always in the back of my mind in everything that I do.
Yes, I relate to that very deeply. And that was actually something that I was very much on my mind while working on genderqueer is my sort of like mission statement was like, this is a book that I want to build bridges, not burn them, is was sort of like what I was thinking. And I was like, I am writing this book because I want to feel more connected to my family, not because I want my family to feel betrayed, exposed, etc. And I wrote the book in some ways, the book is like a long letter to my parents and specifically some of my extended family, like my aunts and uncles, all of whom are very loving and very supportive, but were also very unprepared to talk about gender when I started bringing it up. Just they hadn't thought about it very much. So they didn't really have any context. They hadn't done all the reading. They had not read 100 books about it. And so they didn't really know what to say about it. So, but while I was reading it, or while I was writing it, pretty much anytime someone says something to me that is mean or hurtful, whenever possible, I had that speech bubble just coming from off panel. So I didn't show who was saying it because I was like, this is not about showing people being mean. It's more about me processing a thing that was said to me and trying to like use that to learn and grow. And so yeah, I trying to just be so compassionate and so generous. And then I let every person in my book read the pages that they were in before it was published at the pencil stage. And then if they had anything that they felt uncomfortable with, like we would have a conversation about like, that's not how you remember it? What do you remember saying? That kind of thing. So that even the process of working on it would hopefully strengthen my connections to those friends and family members. Yeah.
Yeah, I admire that about your work, because the intention behind it is really clear. And it's interesting in talking about sort of our shared upbringing of how much time we spent alone outside. I think
Yeah.
at some level, because I've spent a lot of time working in really isolated stretches of Alaska and Antarctica, and I lived alone in the woods without cell service or internet for half a year last year. So I spent a lot of time just looking at incomprehensibly vast landscapes, and it makes you think on the scale of geologic time.
Yes.
And I think that once you have that notion, like you really feel in your bones the smallness of humans as animals.
Yeah.
It's just really hard to be judgmental.
Yeah. And also you just sort of look around and see that every human is in some way a complicated animal just trying to like live the best they can. And like so many of us, it's like when we are mean, it's because we are cold or hungry or in our lower back hurts or something like that, or we're really stressed about like basic needs being met. And and if we could all just try to remember that everyone has a lot of bad days, especially in the past 4 years, but hopefully less in the 4 years to come. And just be kind whenever you can. I think we might be out of time. I could talk to you all day.
Unfortunately, we are. It's hard to believe that we're already at the end of this session. Thank you, Maia and Tessa, so much. That was such a wonderful conversation. You had great questions for each other, and it feels like such an important and timely conversation to have. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
A couple of notes before we leave. Just want to, 1 second. Oops.
Were there any questions in the Q&A that we needed to address, or did we spin through all our time?
There is one question, if you wanted to very quickly answer it, Maia. It is a question for you, which was, is there a Maia reading list book down the road with reviews and tangents?
Oh, it's just my Goodreads account. If you look up my author account on Goodreads, I review 100 books per year. So you can hear everything I think about books.
Oh, that's amazing.
Awesome.
One more quick book tangent, because I love playing book matchmaker. But Maia, have you read Sodaja by Anik C?
Not yet.
It is amazing. Sodaja is a Portuguese word that means a longing for something that never quite existed. And just read it. Everyone read it.
Okay.
Sodaja, Anik C.
Awesome, thank you. So if anyone was inspired to make your own zines after watching this, or if you already are a zine maker, we would love to have you contribute them to the Sonoma County Library Archive. So here's some information about that, and we'll also put the link for that in the chat so that you can go straight to the website. And would also like to point you to the Artists Alley video that was created as part of Zine Fest. So this is an amazing showcase of some other awesome artists and zine makers, and it can be found on the Sonoma County Library YouTube channel, and we'll put the link for that in the chat as well. And again, this has been recorded in English and Spanish, and that will be on our YouTube channel as well in just a couple days. And then if you are registered for the next session with Yael Levy, please do log into that in just a couple minutes. And if you're not registered for it and you're realizing that that was a terrible mistake to make, we're going to put the Zoom link for that in the chat as well. We still have room so you could join. And really quick, we only have about 1 minute, but I believe that Mare is going to just give us a little preview of some of Yael's work.
Hi, thanks, Tara. Yes, I wish that I had more visual aids. Sadly, I do not. I will tell you that the next session is going to be a demo, a comic making demo from Yael. She is an incredible artist, a gifted storyteller, and she has a really fun, positive energy and is so amazing to everybody. If you've never drawn a zine or if you've been drawing for 50 years, I think you will really enjoy the next session that we have coming up with Yael.
Yael was a classmate of mine at California College of the Arts in San Francisco.
Oh, see, there you go.
I endorse this coming thing. Yeah, and I just want to say, thank you so much, Tessa. I absolutely love talking to you. We have to talk to each other more. And thank you, Tara and Mer and Chelsea and everyone else for hosting this.
Yes, thank you so much to both of you. This was a fascinating conversation. I'm so happy that we were able to make it happen.
Yes, thank you everyone, and thanks for everyone who attended. Just to end. This has been
and I can't wait to read your book in
late 2022.
Can't wait.
All right, wonderful. Thank you everyone so much for coming, and hope to see you in the next session. Have a great day.
Bye now.
Thanks.